Hey there, folks. Happy Wednesday, and thanks for tuning into today's webinar. Today, we're going to have a bit of a discussion around pricing in this market, especially really important in the softening market. So we wanted to give you some really practical advice on how to do that most effectively. I'm joined by Braden, who's the chair of the Residential Sales Chapter Committee today. And so, Braden.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for tuning in. Thanks to Betty and Matt and all the everyone on our residential sales committee that have put this initiative in to discuss this today. It's been really good to have them involved. Good morning.
Great. Let's dive straight into it. A couple of the topics that we wanted to discuss today is how to have pricing discussions. Braden, like what are the things that you do, I guess, when speaking to a vendor around pricing?
Yeah, I guess pricing is probably one of the most important discussions I think you have with your vendors when they're engaging you for your advice and your expertise. So my discussions with vendors tend to be a lot more evidence-based.
Yeah.
So, pitching a pie in the sky type scenario and not having any evidence to back that up is certainly not the type of agent that I wanted to be. And so I use a lot of more evidence-based.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what kind of evidence?
That's becoming more difficult now, though, because nowadays you can't get evidence if the market's moving down. It's hard, you've got to sort of gauge what that last one sold for. And the days are gone where people can expect more. My next door neighbour sold for one price, so I'm going to get more. It doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
But there are comparable sales. But I think most importantly at the moment, we also need to look at what's on the market when you're pricing and how much they are asking and where they're setting themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point. No longer can you just expect that you're going to add the 10% on top of the next, sale. Got to really look at what's on the market right now. And I think from our perspective, I'm sure we all agree that the best way to do that is to understand buyers right now that are in the marketplace that can actually give that feedback, back to you.
Yeah.
What other evidence do you sort of rely on when you're determining price?
I think you touched on one really important thing is knowing the buyers in the marketplace, knowing the target buyer for that specific property.
Yeah.
And then I think that really gives you great knowledge on what you think it could be worth, or the buyers is in their budgets. I think knowing your buyers is a very important thing.
Knowing where they're coming from, why are they looking to buy here, and how much more will they pay for a high side property than a low side property?
Yeah.
How much more will they pay for a full brick house to a brick veneer house? There's so many variances, and we have to think of ourselves like a valuer and look at all the same points that the valuers look at, because ultimately the bank might need to come and do a valuation, so we need to be in line with that. So I just keep mine in line with those aspects.
And ultimately, as much as we like to think there's a bit of a science towards pricing, I think we can all agree that real estate, residential real estate especially, is a highly emotional sort of transaction. So it's almost, how do you quantify emotion? And I think it's a matter of, like you said, Betty, understanding the motives of the buyers and what they really value most. So I think that's really important. So I guess what discussions do you have with your vendors, when you're pricing property around? Because I know that some owners are obviously, they're thinking aspirationally, and you don't want to shatter their dreams.
Yeah, it's a juggling act, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a number of factors that we deal with as residential sales agents. Vendors' expectations, buyers, reality of what they want to pay for things. We also deal with other real estate agents as well. I don't want to talk us down or anything, but some people have more motivation to maybe pump up the price a little bit to help them get the business. So there's a number of things that you've got to take into account there. I do like ranges. I do like using ranges, and obviously within the Act there's a 10% limit on your variance within the range, and I think that's a much smarter way for me in my area up on the far north coast to price things. So, I mean, what do you guys do?
Yeah, look, I think you got to look at the property itself and decide what's best for the property. I know that when Betty and I had a bit of a discussion before around, how we price properties, I guess in, areas that are quite saturated and, you've got the bargain hunters, you kind of want to give a range as to where you're expecting price to be. Obviously, if it's evidence-based, you'll get a market reaction towards that. But, I mean, do you use any other sort of pricing?
Look, I think the most important thing is to have a price, because a lot of properties now, I think it's they're taking a shortcut and not putting a price on. And if there's no price actually shown, you lose a number of buyers. Firstly, you don't have the credibility and the transparency. And the buyers they'll go to the properties that have a price first. And we've proven that we can get 50% more buyers to a house with a price than a house without a price. So it makes a huge difference just having a price. So whether you do a fixed price, whether you do a range, but I'd mostly do auctions, so I'll have an auction guide. I might start at the first figure of my ESP, but then I might move that up. I might say the whole range in the second week.
Based on feedback.
And then based on feedback.
Yeah.
And if the buyers are talking higher, or if I have an offer, I'm not scared of putting my range up, because nowadays the prices aren't going sort of 10, 20, 30% above our range. The buyers are trying to buy below the range. So I find by having a more accurate range, at least I'll get it sold in my range.
And there's a nugget of gold, there from Betty. I think there's all the evidence that suggests that buyers actually, it's one of the common frustrations according to realestate.com. So it's really important to have that price guide on there and be accountable to it. I think a lot of the agents' fears, I heard Shannon Whitney say once at a conference, a lot of the agents' fears are around actually being accountable to that price. So really pride yourself in your market knowledge and don't be afraid of putting that price on there, because if you know your stuff, then it shouldn't be a problem. And as Betty said, it's okay to be humble in the initial instance as long as you move with the buyer feedback.
Yeah, I think it shows transparency. It shows, I think if a buyer doesn't see a price on a property, they wonder why. I think it adds to your nurture with your buyers and getting to know them, and eventually obviously helping the vendors get a better result. But I think that the pricing is an important thing, and we see it. One property that, for instance, we didn't have a price on it the first week. One person through. The next week we put a price on it, and there was 8 people through the next open house. So they want to see it, and otherwise they don't waste their time.
Our numbers are slightly different here, but no price could mean 10 or 12 people.
Yes.
With a price is 25, 30 people.
Yeah, right.
So we know that, having a price, having it more accurate, people will come.
It's good evidence.
Yeah. And they just want to know that, we know what we're talking about. And they don't want to waste their time going to a property where they're not affording it. They can't, it's not in their price bracket. So that's wasting their Saturday. So they don't appreciate that.
So maybe just touching on, estimated selling prices. I think, I hope that the Smart Brigade that's watching it is well across that. But just to, reiterate, I guess what the ESP, is and what it requires us to do as agents.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can read out there. We've got our copy of the Act here, which is readily available. If anyone wants to contact us after, we can certainly give you that link.
Very clear.
Yeah, and the estimated selling price, you can read it verbatim. Is a reasonable estimate of the likely selling price. So again, we're not all fortune tellers. We don't have crystal balls, but it is important to make sure that your estimated selling price is reasonable, and this is what you get paid to price property. So
So I think some of the challenges that a lot of the viewers might be facing as well is how to decipher between what the owner's aspirations are and I guess pricing. Betty, how do you sort of handle that? Because there's a difference between aspirations and owners' bottom lines. So how do you approach that?
Look, our job is we work for the vendors. Our job is always to get the vendors the best price possible. And sometimes the vendors are still back in 2017 in their thinking, or even 2018. But, we have to look at today's market. And as long as they've seen, I think it's a lot easier now, certainly a lot easier this year, because they've all seen the evidence, they've seen the sales. So that means that it's not such a hard job on us. It's because they've seen it themselves. And all they need to trust that we're getting them the best price out there, and that our strategies are solid, and we know how to get to that. To get to that price.
It's about having those conversations up front. Wouldn't you agree? Front end those conversations.
I do it straight up, and I might lose some listings over it, but I'm never going to sort of buy a listing, put the price too high, and then start bringing it down. It just doesn't work. And I noticed even with fair trading at the moment, you've got to be, if you don't do pricing properly, and if you're you can't just go and put a low figure in the back end and expect people to rock up, because they've got evidence of all that now, so they can see what you've done. It's important to put your correct guide and bring people in. And once your vendors know you're doing that properly, they know that the buyers coming into that open house are legitimate buyers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and the argument is as well, when we're talking about estimated selling prices and ranges, and what what you're advertising versus what you may be telling buyers, which is certainly something that was cracked down on a number of years ago.
Yeah.
Essentially, if you're telling buyers a lower price, you maybe even attracting buyers at a lower level. So
to your owner's detriment.
Yeah, to your owner's detriment, and I think it's something that it was done in the past, and it's not to say it's not still being done now, but certainly as we move into professionalism, it's got to be stamped out. And as Betty you alluded to before, I think everything's tracked now digitally.
Yes.
So I would hate to try to do something like that, because you would be found out.
Yeah,
I think
there's a timestamp and a digital record for if you're doing the wrong thing in the back end of search engine. So it's really important to know that that fair trading has sought that information from back end data. So I think that's really important for people to note as well.
I guess this was probably moving on to something we were going to talk about later, but the variance of that estimated selling price. Yeah. Something that there's a lot of confusion if you call the owner and they say drop the price, or how do you guys handle that?
Yeah, well, I think best practice wise, it's really I think it's a great idea to obviously fill in the relevant form depending on which franchise you're with, or if you're using REI forms. It would be really prudent to get the vendor's signature on any change to price and the evidence associated with it. Is that the kind of the way that you would do it?
I can change a price sometimes 3 or 4 times during a campaign. So it's just a new form. Sometimes I leave the forms with the vendor so they can just scan it or photograph it and send it back to me. But it's better to just keep changing it, make the price more accurate, keep the purchasers happy, and they know that that our property is going to sell.
How do conversations with buyers go when you're actually moving price? Are they appreciative of it? I imagine they would be.
They love it, and they do ask, and we explain why we're doing it, and they actually appreciate the fact that we're not wasting their time.
Totally.
And we're giving them, because if we had it say from 900 to 990, and they said, well, really our budget is 850, so you're saying I don't have a chance, and they say no, it'll go in our range.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think buyers do also learn. I think they with certain agents in certain regions, if you've got the buyers looking in those suburbs dealing with those same agents, the buyers, you might not think it, people out there, but they all realise who's
doing what,
who works what way, and who
they adjust their behaviour.
So kind of you're not helping yourself, but and the buyers will come back to you. They trust you a bit more if you're honest and transparent, and again, it's really important, that pricing and the transparency to the market.
And I know from the school of John Cunningham, if a buyer's well informed, and he will love me for saying this, if a buyer's well informed and you give them all the information, they'll make a better decision and they'll actually end up paying more. So that's always been our experience. When a buyer's well informed and they've been treated with transparency, they'll end up paying more, whether it be before auction day, they'll listen to your recommendations, or actually at auction day.
And John McGrath just said the same thing in our webinar yesterday. But look, it's really, really important to put that price in. If you don't have it, they won't come.
So if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand on the digital hand on the webinar. We'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
We do have a question.
One from Joshua Thomas. He's asking, are you only increasing your guide if an offer has been made, or if general feedback is higher?
It's a really good question. Absolutely, really good question. Look, I think that my opinion is that if you have a lot of confidence that you have interest or feedback has been above where you're suggesting, it's prudent to actually amend your guide. But in the absence of a firm offer, I appreciate that that's a difficult thing to do. It really is up to your discretion. I mean, you also don't want to be burning the campaign by raising the guide in the absence of an offer. How would you approach it?
So if I've got a firm offer, the guide comes up straight away.
Well, has to.
Has to. But if I've got one person talking at this price and everyone else is talking here, I'll leave the guide where it is, or I'll try and get this person to sign a contract and
take it off the market.
But if they're all talking at the same level, then I've definitely moved the guide up. It's, again, high confidence. When you know, because that doesn't lie. If you've got 7 or 8 people all talking around the same price and you keep advertising here, all you're going to do is pull those buyers down to that level.
Yeah. And Josh, I guess to answer your question, how do you really determine feedback that is, good information for you to base that decision on? And I think it really comes from, a bit of experience in being able to qualify that buyer, sufficiently. I mean, I know I like to think that buyers can really trust us, but the reality is they're not going to tell you exactly where they think the property is going to be. It requires a higher level of being able to qualify them, what else they've seen, what else they've missed out on, understanding what their motivations and budgets are. Because if you quite simply ask them, hey, what do you think this property is worth? You're likely to get a really conservative answer from them, and a decision, on the campaign shouldn't be based purely on that.
No.
Yeah. Do you guys get buyers that you deal with on a regular basis?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you see them at every open house. You call them twice a week.
Yeah.
Your rapport's ridiculous. So you list something and they go, what have I got to pay?
Yeah.
And you'll tell them and they'll pay it.
Yeah.
Right. That happened to me again last week, another property. That's the type of real estate agent, that's the type of industry that we should be, is that we have those clients and you tell them the price, they agree, and that the deal is done. And the vendor's happy, they've got their price.
But that's because they trust you, they trust the process, and they know you're consistent with how you do things.
You're not. Yeah, I think it's trust. It is trust. Yeah.
That's the ultimate aim, I guess, for people to just say, hey, what do we need to do to buy it? And us being that advisor and give them that guidance to actually, move them into a home. I think that's the ultimate aim. Now, when, you touched on, how you deal with buyers, I guess what's really good practice, because it all really does dovetail into having these pricing discussions. How do you understand what buyers really value most? And that will in turn help you more when you're pricing.
Well, I think it's like the quality of questions that you're asking.
Yeah.
And, now, well, in our marketplace, there's less buyers through open houses. So we're finding that we're almost having an interview with them at the open house.
Yeah.
So it is, what do you like? What don't you like?
Yeah.
What's the perfect property?
Yeah.
Again, it's all questions that you can ask, and I can share my open house scripts and stuff with people if they like. But
and there's the offer.
No, but everyone is different. But I think it's asking the right questions and not wasting their time on things that they might not like.
Totally.
But
what are some of the questions that you ask?
You need to find out why they're there. What is it that drew you
their
to this house?
Was
it the schools? Was it the proximity to the station? Was it the fact that this is a full brick house and most of the others are single brick? What actually did you really appreciate about this house? Once you know the intimate questions, I'm only buying a full brick house. Then you've got what level you can work with that person.
Do you have finance approved?
No, but even deeper.
Are you unconditionally approved?
But even deeper, when does your pre-approval expire?
When does it expire? That's our biggest question at the moment.
Like that, because there's a difference. We're finding a lot, buyers are sort of saying, I've got pre-approval or finance shouldn't be a problem. No, hang on, you've got to ask that extra question. When does that pre-approval expire? Oh, well, I haven't got pre-approval yet. Well, you probably need to work on that. And just having that confidence to give that guidance, well, that's probably a first port of call, right? Because otherwise they're probably mistaken in how quickly they can act.
And coming back to where we said where we're moving the guide up.
Oh, geez, you don't want to do that.
If I didn't know that I had all, sort of finance approved buyers in that range, I'm not moving the guide up, because you can have people that like the house, but are they able to buy the house? That's the real question.
It's tough.
Totally. Yeah, exactly right. So I guess just on that, if anybody has any questions regarding legislation, it's important to speak to, the helpline. That's what it's there for members.
Yes.
I think we have another question.
Yeah. So we've got a question from Susanna here. She's asking, do you favor one pricing method or do you work with varying pricing methods?
Great question. We were going to get to that, which is what we're going to talk about right now.
So, talking about that. That depends on your market and your area, obviously. But what's and does a property suit a particular style of marketing? If there's already 10 units in a block that have just sold for a price, it's really hard to go and do anything out of the box, differently to, putting a price on or putting a narrow range. Whereas if there's nothing even similar that's sold, I would use a range, and if it seems a bit like this house is better than what it appears to be, I'd probably just start with the beginning of my range and then add the second figure of my range later. So I vary it depending on how many comparable sales like that have sold, how many are on the market for sale, and yeah, they're the main methods that I use anyway.
Yeah. I'm probably the same as well. I don't really have a set structure for every property, whether it's an option. I do like the ranges of, you know, especially I find that they're working better than a set price at the moment. Most buyers that we're dealing with in the far north coast, they're after bargains. They know if they're cashed up and approved, then they can throw out figures and sit and wait. And
Correct,
there's not a lot of negotiating. So having a range, it's in the range, or they're not even going to consider it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting because in the market that I operate in on the northern beaches, there's certain areas where you're right, you know, a range is really appropriate because there's not going to be a big variance on what a buyer will pay for a particular property if there's a lot of evidence around, you know, recent sales. So in that case, a range is really helpful because what I find is if you put a single figure on it, you'll generally get buyers that will come in under because that's what they feel like they're conditioned to do in this market. So having that range and giving absolute clarity to the buyers is great. And I think the argument for a lot of people will be, well, is that limiting the price? Well, no, it isn't. Obviously, through competition and through your skills of negotiation, you can highlight, you know, the reasons why they should be paying towards the upper end or even sometimes beyond it. So don't be fearful of that upper end. But equally, you know, if there's not a whole lot of evidence or if there's a certain emotional factor about a property, you might just want to keep that, you know, that single figure on, and then later on in the campaign when you've learned a little bit more about where feedback is going is to put that upper end in, you know, in an auction scenario even as well. So, but yeah, really good question. Again, if you have any questions about how we price properties, we're all more than happy to chat to any of you about that, and our details can be available there as well.
I would just obviously also mention that helpline again. Really, really valuable. I called them a number of times, not very often, but certainly if you get stuck with something that you're not quite sure about, it's a free service. We can put the number up on here, but it's 0292642343.
And it is a free service, and they are great, and they know anything. If you just need to, you know, double check something, it's worthwhile calling.
So when, you know, I think we've talked a little bit about, you know, when we need to revise ESP, and I think that's, you know, that's really important to do in the, you know, in the proper way according to, you know, what your franchise has specified, or, you know, best practice is to obviously get agreement there in writing, you know, from the owner. So
it's okay if you get price wrong, and that's something that, you know, you shouldn't hide behind the fact that, you know, we're all human, and we all do make mistakes. And there's sometimes when you love something, you love the property, you would buy it if
sometimes as much as the
money, but maybe the buyers didn't quite see it the way that you do. And having that conversation with the owner, it's tough. It is not a great conversation. It comes with a bit of experience as to how to do it. But, you know, having that conversation and adjusting or revising that ESP, you know, you've got to do it, I think, and you've got to, it's going to help them get to where they want to be. But yeah, so we do, like with Betty, with McGrath, we have a form that we fill out, and the variation to our estimated selling price. We have the client sign it. We also provide them with newer evidence, so newer recent sales or a CMA. And we find that that's best practice because they're understanding where we're coming from. And, you know, you can update that with all the buyers as well with the same recent sales. So.
And I think it's important to know, like, you know, you've been employed to actually sell the property, not to love it to death as well. As much as we want to get the best price, it's important to understand your vendors, you know, motivations and get an understanding of where they're really at. Because if you sit there, you know, protecting price also for too long, it might mean that you're actually doing your vendor a disservice, as much as that's not your intention. And I appreciate that it's not anyone's intention to do that. But it's important to really keep, you know, your finger on the pulse with what's happening in that campaign.
Can we touch on that again, maybe talking about how to win the business transparently? Betty?
I just show at the moment, for sales are the most relevant. You need a little bit of evidence. I don't go back more than 3 months unless it's in the same street, but then I explain the percentage difference that would have been in the same street. I think it's better if you're in competition with the ones that are on the market now. So it's really important to know where they're at. And I find that the websites are good now because you can print everything in price order. So even when agents put the contact agents or the expressions of interest, you still sort them, and this is what the buyers are doing. So then you know exactly where they're sitting and where they're attracting buyers and where we need to be to attract our buyers.
I think the best thing for the audience to do is to understand what's below the surface with a lot of the properties that are on the market right now. And the only way to do that is through having a really good relationship with buyers. It's really powerful to say to an owner, look, these are the 3 that you're going to be competing with if we went to market tomorrow. I know this about this property. I know that about that property. I know this about that property. All of a sudden, you're positioned as the authority in the market, and you can actually give that pricing discussion better. For me, I know that historical data is important to an extent, but it's probably more, relevant in the market that we're in right now, is to have an understanding of what's on the market and really frank information, below the surface information about what that looks like. So I think to answer your question, that's a great way to win business transparently and giving owners, really good information around that so they can make a better decision ultimately. Did you want to add anything to that? How do you sort of approach it? I think we've got a couple of minutes left.
I think it's hard because you deal with, it's a competitive business industry that we're in. And when you're trying to win the business and the owner says, X person said it's worth 1.3, Y person said it's worth 1.1, Braden, you're here telling me it's worth 850. And
what do you think?
Like,
based on the info.
Well, and it is like, well, here's the evidence.
I can't see the I can't see the 1, 2, 1.
And that's where, unfortunately, again, at sometimes you have to say no to the business as well. So if it isn't priced correctly, do you want to be that person working on it for 6 months
for free?
Getting it right up front. Getting it right up front.
Better pick it up second time.
Anyway,
I think we'll almost wrap up there. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Other questions?
Is there any other questions before we head away?
I might have one last quick
Oh,
question.
we can sneak it in.
Yep. We've got a question here from Jay. He's having difficulty getting vendors to amend the price.
Sure.
How would you, what tips would you give him to get vendors across the line to amending the price?
Again, really great question. Thanks so much for asking. I guess if the property's been on the market, your evidence really lies within the buyers and the quality of questions that you're asking. What buyers have you met that have bought other properties and why have they made that decision? So getting really granular in the information, again, that you're providing your owners.
I think you've got to lift your communication with them. I'm not sure how often you're talking to them. It could be like, well, you're making all these calls to these people, and all these people that have seen your place didn't react to your pricing, and they went and bought something else.
But in your strategy meeting, again, I'm sure that you guys do the same. In your strategy meeting, it's really important to say, hey, these are the key metrics that we can expect from the campaign. If we're below par, well, it's very clear that changes need to be made, and actually highlighting that, hey, we need to make some changes if we don't get 12 people through this weekend. So they're going to be expecting that, that information and hitting those markers throughout the campaign. It's almost like a science.
There's one other circumstance, though, because a lot of the buyers have bought in the previous market. So I've got builders in that situation at the moment where I've got the offer on the table, but Betty, that's below what we paid. What do
Negative
I do?
Equity.
So, how do you talk somebody into taking a loss now? And that might be Jay's point, as well. If it's that, it's really hard to get people to accept, I've got to drop 200.
Just your honesty. You've just got to be honest, and you've got to have those critical conversations.
Again, you could be doing more harm by actually, skirting around, the issue. If you look at when your leverage is the highest as a seller, it's within the first few weeks, or within the first 4 weeks is when your leverage is at the highest. So changes need to be made.
You touched on this before. You remove yourself from the market. It's not your fault that the price isn't there. And it's important to remember that, but also that they will probably thank you later on. They might not like you in that 10 minutes, but they will thank you later on for being the honest agent.
But to answer your question as well, the conversation to amend price is much easier if you give them a sense of what to expect right from the beginning. and that's really powerful. So thanks so much for your questions.
Thank you,
you know, any questions that you have regarding, you know, legislation, the helpline's always there. We're always happy to help as well. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.